I want to talk about this book because you speak about the rhythms of the Jesus life. And I think what struck me about the book is there's a lot of people want to speak about the life of Jesus, but not the Jesus life. And I want to read the scripture that you started with in the introduction, and it comes from Romans 6:13. And the Apostle Paul, you said, wrote this to Rome, so I'll take your word for it. He says, "Do not let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. Instead, give yourselves completely to God, for you were dead, but now you have new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God." I want to ask you, Christians today, how can they use their bodies for the glory of God? And why did you write this book specifically focusing on the practical life of Christ that is manifest in our world today?
Yeah, I think it comes out of my own questions about what it means to be a disciple or an apprentice of Jesus. I remember in my 20s, I really started to wonder what it means to be a follower of Christ.
Yeah.
Not just in an intellectual sense. I think in a huge way, my own life was challenged by the fact that I can keep my Christianity in my head. And that it doesn't flow out into the rest of my life. And started to think about the beautiful descriptions the Apostle Paul uses for the church. We are the body of Christ. Christ is the head. So I started to wonder, what does it mean to actually have a faith that is not just an intellectual exercise, but is embodied through, words, hands, feet. I was raised in a Christian idiom that focused a lot on certain aspects of Christianity and got almost captured in specific phrases like, do you have Jesus in your heart?
Yes.
Was the main question, which is not a bad thing. I think having Christ in our heart is a really good beginning, but started to wonder, in a country like South Africa, what does it mean to actually have a faith that is embodied personally, but then also what does it mean to be choreographed in the Spirit as the body of Christ?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned, and I'll quote the book often, but on page 27, you say and you write the following. You say, "Grace forgives, but it also empowers." And what do you mean by it? Does it mean that our everyday walk and our everyday life is empowered by these rhythms of grace? Or is it that religiously we can only call upon grace once we ask for the forgiveness of sin?
Yeah, it's interesting for me if we think of broad, categories of theology. When South Africans, and I come from the Afrikaner tribe mostly, grace or genade a lot of times just get reduced to the forgiveness of sin.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And the theological category is obviously justification, so we're justified by grace. And I absolutely believe in that. God initiates, forgives. But then God, I think, also invites us into an adventure of the big word, obviously, sanctification, which is the other part. And grace is as needed there as it is in terms of our forgiveness. And I think, for me, the rhythms are ways in which we open our lives so that grace can enter also through our daily work, our daily lives. And in that way, I was really influenced by a man named Dallas Willard, where he said, that one of the things we should watch for is that, we sometimes think grace excludes effort. And he always said, grace is opposed to earning.
Yes.
It's not opposed to effort.
Very good.
And I think it's that part that I mean with, that we need the grace of our everyday lives too. The spirit of sanctification. It's also a work of God's grace.
Yeah, on page 31, you speak about synchronicity between heart, mind, and body, which is crucial in the development of this raw spirituality. Can you just describe to us what it means when you speak of raw spirituality and how we are transformed by the grace that we've received when we speak about raw spirituality? Because for me personally, when I read the book, for me, the value of the book, again, it is, people can find the book online, but the value of the book is it gives you proximity to head, mind, and also spirit, heart. And it allows for you not just to live a professed faith, but to live an actual faith that is relevant to the world. And when you describe raw spirituality, do you mean that it is a emphasis on living a messy life, or a life that is not really detached from the everyday life of the world? Because in our context, you very much pointed to this. We like to compartmentalize our actual lives from our spiritual lives. And there's not an interface between the two. So what I do on a Sunday in the church service might be totally detached from who I am during the week. And then the other way around, what I am not on a Sunday, unfortunately, also gets reflected in the week. So what do you mean when you speak about raw spirituality?
Yeah, let me tell you, when you work as an author, a lot of times you have a working title for a book. My working title for this book comes out of 1 Timothy 4, where Paul writes to Timothy and says, train yourself towards godliness.
Sure.
So my working title for the book was actually Training Naked with the Friends of Jesus.
Yeah, for sure.
And my publisher said, listen, the book will end in the sex, division of the bookshops. And said then, let's try and figure out a different metaphor. So the raw spirituality, the raw has a few angles to it. The one is the honesty, the rawness of life. That when God invites us into the adventure of embodying Christ's life in us, He invites us into the genuine specifics of our life. So in that sense, it's the rawness. It's not polished. It's not, that we get to a place where we are honest.
Yes.
So getting to that original title, when Paul uses the word and says, train yourself to godliness, it has an emphasis on being open. The Greek there, gymnazo, literally means train naked.
Yeah.
So the raw part of that is, it's honest. The other one is that we have lives that is the raw material in which we are being shaped. So, some people wish for a life that is different.
Yeah.
And then they they miss God's work in them because they're wishing an arena that's not their life.
Sure.
So your life has relationships and work aspects, and it's within that life that the Spirit invites us towards this synchronicity that I'm talking about, where we learn how to live there in the rawness of our life. So I think those two aspects of the metaphor, gives a form to the book's writing. As an author, you're in conversation with editors the whole time. So that's what we landed on when I couldn't get my Training Naked with the Friends of Jesus title, which I, by the way, still think it's a more provocative and fun.
Maybe in the future, maybe with a revised standard edition.
Yeah.
On page 33, you speak about Jesus' understanding of kingdom, and you write, when Jesus uses kingdom language, it is not just a synonym for heaven. When we look at kingdom, what did Jesus mean when he spoke about kingdom?
Yeah, I think, let me first say that, again, in my tribe, the Afrikaner tribe, but I think, I lived in America for 3 years, so I can almost say that I know this is true for them too. A lot of Christians, when they hear the word kingdom, immediately think it's a synonym for heaven.
Yeah, for sure.
And with heaven, they mostly imagine a disembodied afterlife with God that is blissful and wonderful, which I think is not a helpful way of having a reflex on the word kingdom. So for me, the kingdom has a rich biblical understanding that Jesus embodies, first of all.
Yeah.
In the early church, a person like Origen called Christ the auto-kingdom. He said he's the kingdom enfleshed. And I think the kingdom is that reality where what God wants done is done. And that the invitation of kingdom then is to acknowledge there is a king.
Yeah, for sure.
To acknowledge that there is a sovereignty of that king that has a specific reality. and that if we want to get the color and hue of what the kingdom is, then I think can't do better than to look at how Jesus lived that life. And that it gives us the contours of what a kingdom life looks like. Jesus, I think, made this so central that, when he taught his disciples to pray, he said, "May your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven."
Yeah, for sure.
Which is an interesting thing, because if you made the synonym kingdom and heaven, then just in that prayer that we are invited into, you'll have to think a little bit about, what does that look like?
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
yeah.
And Howsey, I can remember the story of Floyd McClung, where he spoke and he gave a testimony at Tux's Missions Week, to make it more relevant, of him working in the red light district in Amsterdam, and ultimately really the vocation that he had with his wife was to restore a mental picture of who God was. And you write on page 40 of the book, "All of us paint mental pictures of Jesus. Our engagement with raw spirituality starts with our God pictures." Can I ask you the following? Because I think in a country where a lot of people are looking for identity, and obviously the reason some people in public media is so popular, especially politicians, is because they are feeding into that identity that a new raw youth is longing for. When we look at God, what does it mean when we speak about having the right aptitude and picture about God as you described in the book?
Yeah, I think one of the assumptions I make in the book is that every person lives with an image of God.
Yes.
And, going back to the prayer that Jesus taught us, when he teaches us, "Hallowed be your name," it's really, teach us what you look like. And I think in South Africa, it's very interesting to think through what are those images that people live with. In my own pastoral work, cross-culturally, for instance, I was quite surprised to find that, a lot of people that live in poverty think that there is a God that drives and gives white people success.
For sure.
So sometimes even in some of our townships, people will talk about the white God and the black God. I've discovered that some people's image of God is really very aggressive. God, becomes almost like a Terminator kind of image, that, he'll be back and then he's going to really punish everyone. Some people live with a picture of God that's totally permissive. I think one of the things in rich Western culture is that the issue of deism becomes a real driving image, that God is really only, farly removed from reality.
Yeah, for sure.
And part of working with God images is discovering people's operative God images. So with youth these days, I sometimes just ask them, take out your phone and use your emojis to show me, what emoji represents your God. And what's fascinating to me is that I would say almost 70% of the times the image that young people in our country uses is a very angry emoji.
Sure.
I think to work with that is very important, because that drives your life.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it all starts with the image of Christ. And I think it was Karl Barth that said that if we really want to know what God is like, God is Christ-like. And you focus on 3 points on page 42, and I'll read this to you. You say, Jesus' master's class consists of 3 parts. The first part explores the place where we paint. The second part explores pictures of other people that other people draw, and is captured in the question, who do the people say that I am? And the third part is the personal question, who do you say that I am? That central question of the person of Jesus Christ that leads us from the place where we have to get a conceptual understanding of the identity of the one God. Can you lead us and show us, how do we find those 2 questions, and how do we make it relevant to our own context, and how we see God as being represented in this Jesus Christ?
Yeah, I think so. I'm a Christian, and I write from that locus. Obviously, you quoted Bart. He's one of his sparring partners was a theologian that I love, Hans Urs von Balthasar.
Yeah.
Where von Balthasar said, the beauty of the life of Jesus is that Jesus translates God in the language of the human life.
Sure.
And so I think once someone has discovered that there is a God, then one need to get sources to think through. Okay, but what is the character of this God? And as followers of God in Christianity, we confess that we believe in God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
The triune God.
The triune God. And so from that point, we start to paint pictures of God. And part of my own experience is that the masterclass that I talk about there is, if we are left to our own devices, we can easily paint caricatures of God. Yesterday, I conducted a funeral, and the deceased's family and friends used the weirdest sources to give hope. A Lady Gaga song.
Oh, wow.
The Sound of Silence of Deliverance.
Yeah.
And my conversation now afterwards will be, listen, if those are the sources that paint reality, then it's really very hopeless. And so for me, if someone answers those questions, who is God, you have to start to have conversations about what informs as sources for those conversations. And the Matthew 16, I think it's Mark 8, Luke 9, almost all of those in the middle of the Gospels. Jesus turns the attention to his own 12 followers and starts to redefine images that they have of him. And it's interesting for me that he starts with the wider question, who do the people say I am? But then he asks them a collective question, but now, who do you say I am? I think sometimes we can think that that's an individualistic question, but it was also addressed to a group of disciples. And the church has always been, if I can use the metaphor, painting groups of who God is.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think it's very important in a society where people easily say, I'm not religious, I'm just spiritual.
Yeah.
To really dig down and to say, okay, what is your yoga class teaching you about God? What kind of God is there? And to push into that in a reflective way, not non-judgmental. And so the stories I write in Raw Spirituality was deeply informed in a phase in my 20s where I think I for the first time realized that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, paints these vivid pictures of the story and life of Christ that helps to form our image of God.
Yes.
In that phase, I always also realized how easily our classes can become muddled in our drawings when we become too homogeneous, too the same, that sometimes that can, bring huge problems. So I have a beautiful story. One of my friends is a lecturer at a university, and they worked with the text that informs that chapter that you just quoted, Matthew 16. And it was a small class, 10 or so kids, multicultural. And the Sunday school teacher asked the kids, what does Jesus look like? And, there were white kids and kids out of the colored community and Indian kids. And so the kids sort of made an aggregate of all of their colors, which was a very interesting reflection. And they said, he's not a white Jesus. He's obviously not, so they started to work with this composite and took the picture really, seriously in terms of that. But I think, if you look at the Gospels, we get these beautiful, beautiful ways of starting to understand the nature of God. So, yeah.
And I think you're right on page 67. When we plug into God, we make a decision to unplug from other networks.
Mm.
And I think that's the point you're getting to in the book, is ultimately, where do we deduce this understanding from God from?
Mm.
And a lot of times when I reflect upon the church in Africa as a whole,
Mm.
I see a church that is longing for an escape from the real world.
Mm.
I see a church that draws upon the everyday bustle of life, trying to find a God that can serve their needs.
Mm.
And that is why certain things like the prosperity gospel even have grown in Africa.
Mm.
And I'm not going to talk about all the other charlatan tricks, but the reason is very simply that it taps into a legitimate need of the people.
Mm.
And when we look at the God of the Bible ultimately does care about us.
Mm.
And I think sometimes when we look at how we deduce that picture of God, we get to this conceptual reality that ultimately, I can't remember the theologian that said it, but God has created man in his image, and man returned the favor.
Yeah.
And
It was actually Voltaire that I
Voltaire,
think.
in actual fact, that said it.
Yeah.
So for you, when you wrote this book, it obviously, I think a lot of people see the projection outside, but what did it do to you personally as an author? When you go through this journey, it must have hurt quite a lot,
Yeah, I mean, we can go very deep into this, and I'll share a bit about it. I think one of the things that's important is that this book is in the one way it's my story, but
Yes.
it's also the story of a community that have journeyed together. So the book is structured around a church plant that took place in 2003. And Rudolph, a huge part of the journey was discovering that our God images as a collective and individually was really, in some senses, really not healthy.
Yeah.
So growing up as a Afrikaner in South Africa at the back end of apartheid, some of the worst atrocities were perpetrated by my clan in the name of God.
Yeah, for sure.
So deconstructing some of that was really painful. There's a theologian in our country, he passed away. He's also a Smith, Nico Smith, who as a Dutch Reformed minister moved into a township in the 80s because he just felt he couldn't reconcile the God of the Bible with what was being, portrayed by his tribe. And later in his life, he wrote a book with a very provocative title in Afrikaans. The Afrikaans is Die dood van die God van my vaders.
Sure.
The death of the God of my fathers.
Sure.
And I think, in a sense, for us, discovering the way in which Jesus crossed boundaries, loved the other, it became, in the one sense, painful, but on the other sense, deeply freeing to know that we are now, the disciples that are being called to embody some of those journeys. For me personally, it has meant that I were invited into thinking through what sources influenced my own images of God. A lot of them were North American males.
Sure.
Which, they're wonderful authors, but, if you start to do theology in a localized setting, I think things start to shift. And I'm still on that journey.
Yeah, for sure.
I think part of the life of faith is that we are within traditions, and we are, that sort of the railings that keep us,
Okay.
confessionally bound so that we don't color out of the lines. But inside of that, I think there's growth the whole time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you wrote on page 82, and you asked the question, what is church? And I think this is where this book is steering to, redefining certain terms which we grew up with. And you're right, we were church idolaters, deeply addicted to the institution. The church became our all-encompassing reality. The church gave us a purpose in life. The church provided us with a salary. The church was our life, and like all idols, it drained the life out of us. We wrongly believed that we had to grow the church, and in our minds, a big church meant success, and a small church signified irrelevance. Success became our driving narrative. I can't tell you how many people In actual fact, my brother is in America now, but just before he left, we had a conversation of how many people I know that is not part of a church community, yet they deem themselves to be Christian, but in some way or the other they became disillusioned with church. And something that is greatly valuable of this book is it speaks to the heart of the disillusioned. And I'll be honest with you, I think you need to be part of church just for a while before you realize God truly calls broken people. And I always say to people, if you've not been heard in church, just stick around a little while. But what do we say to the disillusioned? And when we speak about raw spirituality, is there a place for people to return to a communal setting where they can rediscover that vigor for the life of Jesus? Because what motivates community is our picture of God and how it impacts the brother that we live together with. Well, how do we speak? And what would you say to the individuals that are watching this today and they are totally disillusioned with Christianity? They love Jesus, but man, they dislike the church. What would you say to people like that?
Yeah, it's a major question, Rudolf. The statistics at the moment worldwide is becoming overwhelming that Christians disengage from formal church settings because of hurt. There's even a category for them now. I think it's called nuns. I think let me just give a bit context of that quote you read. I wrote that as a pastor who burnt out working at a church myself and came to the conclusion that the concept of church became all-encompassing.
Yeah.
And the reason why I call that idol is that it really became the central part of my own journey. And I think a lot of people that are hurt by church, let me not say a lot of them, some of them, I think, are invited to move beyond their critique of church and to start to shift the question to, okay, what does it mean to actually follow Jesus?
Yeah, very good.
So my own ecclesiology shifted the moment I shifted the attention directly on what is church, the question. I think as a primary question, what is church? Or let me say it this way. If what is church is the primary and first question, I think we make category mistakes. We set ourselves up for something that's not helpful because God builds God's church. And the question preceding that is actually, what does it mean to be followers of Christ? So, when we planted the church, Claypot community, that I narrate the story of in Raw Spirituality, in the beginning few months, we asked that question. So what is church? And our questions mostly fizzled out to, but we don't like this, and this is really bad, and this is bad, and we don't like this. And one of my mentors, who has now deceased since then, said to me in a letter, maybe it would be helpful if you shift the question. Maybe rather ask, what does it mean to follow God? So my own thoughts, for people that are disengaged is that sometimes focusing on that can become a way of actually not living into what it means to be a disciple, because you can become a professional critiquer.
Yeah, for sure.
That being said, there are people that have legitimately been hurt by the church. Spiritual abuse in churches is real. There are dynamics that's really destructive. The Roman Catholic Church are being caught out in the last decade or so, but I think what we are seeing worldwide with the Me Too movement in the States that have flowed into church congregations, it's obvious that the Protestant church is not standing in front of the ecclesial community with unwashed hands. So, some people are in very abusive church structures, and those places are not places of safety because, there's not accountability.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think there's a group of people that are not professional critiquers that have really been hurt and been taken advantage of. And then there's another group, I alluded to them before. I think they they fall into the I'm religious or spiritual but not religious category.
Yeah, for sure.
And I said to my wife a few weeks ago, I think we are now in South Africa, in my Afrikaner tribe, in the first time in a phase that I could legitimately say that we're moving into a secular age, that we have kids that have not grown up with any, Christian imagination. Christendom is really busy falling. And some of those people are being raised in the atmosphere of I'm spiritual but not religious. But at some point, the energy of their spirituality fizzles inward and out, basically. And I suspect that church communities that are honestly grappling with how to translate the tradition, capital T, will grow, because the people will be attracted to that.
I agree.
So it's a bit of a long-winded answer.
No, it's perfect, because ultimately I think the question is always, how do we integrate people back into community? And I know that some churches have focused on seeker-sensitive services. Some people have willfully strategized to get a specific medium or people back into their congregation. I can remember one of the churches I pastored. I can remember the one morning I walked into the church offices and the pastor drew a line on a chalkboard, and he said to me, "What are you, managers or pastors?" And we were like, "Pastors." And he says, "No, you're managers."
Oh my goodness.
And the fun fact was that we didn't pastor people, we managed people. And if you manage people, what do? First of all, you look at the bottom line of what that individual gives. So the one that has the highest priority in your zone is usually the one that tithes the most, because he's going to secure that financial income that you need to generate for that zone per month. Communities-wise, why is there a disinterest from the younger generation? There's definitely a significant interest in spirituality. We can see it in the movies that are being made. There's a curiosity right over the world towards something greater, spiritual, some superpowers, etc., etc. How can the church feed that, and how can the church become relevant in a context like that without losing focus of what you've written when you speak about the revelation of this Jesus Christ that makes the one true God known?
Yeah, I mean, that's Rudolf, that's a great question. I think, if I might be so presumptuous, I think sometimes our category mistake starts even with asking the question.
Yeah.
If we start to ask how can the church be relevant, we're focusing in a very subtle way back on ourselves again. I think part of the question communities are standing for is, what is God up to in our neighborhood?
Yes.
What is God up to here in our community of faith? And I think once we start to live into the adventure of joining God in that mission, people will be attracted. The problem comes when we start to, as you said, start to point out specific groups in a community. So I'm differing a bit now from the international conversation, but my Facebook feed is filled with questions like, how can we bring millennials back into the church?
Yeah.
If we focus on them, what we're doing is we're using target mechanisms, target audiences. And I think subtly we can shift again the attention of a community away. So in that sense, there was a British theologian that I really loved, Leslie Newbegin. And Newbegin said, the greatest hermeneutic of God's love is a community that is actually living into this mission of God.
Sure.
And that thing doesn't have an age category on it. What I'm suspecting is that there will be a movement back into the importance of locality where the churches are placed. I think the question of parishes will become more important. That churches that are not a blessing within the geographical area where they're at, if they are not living out God's mission in those communities, I think the group that says we are religious but not or spiritual but not religious,
Yeah.
they're going to say, I can go to a nicer concert than what you're going to bring with your disco lights and your funky
Yeah.
worship music.
And your smoke screens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but that's my thing. So, or my thoughts. I think the church can be relevant if we use that in the sense of how are we apprentice to the mission of God within our neighborhood.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the question on page 107, you speak about the Missio Dei, and you highlight the reality that ultimately the church is just an extension of God's missional nature. And I love that. I think that is spot on. And what I've seen in the past is that churches become a little bit anthropocentric. So it's focused on how can we get people back to the church. But you've just spoken about it, and you said we need to come from the other way around. We need to ask God, Lord, what is your mission in this community? And that will in itself, by its own nature, draw people into the church or into the church community. I want to speak a little bit about the way we perceive that mission of God. Because in a South African context, I've identified before that sometimes we think that the mission of God is chronocentric. It is connected to a specific time or a specific move. And then sometimes, like I said, we even make it ecclesiocentric. In other words, we connect it to a denomination or a church. So everybody's, I'm going to be part of this denomination because the denomination is seemingly going somewhere. And then also what we do is we make it, like I said, focused on a man, anthropocentric, and we follow a man in a community to give light to this mission of God. When we speak about individuals understanding the mission of God, is it something that is birthed from the individual? Is it something that is birthed from a religious context? Is it a blend of all of those things? Or is it seriously something that is birthed as a result of being centered in a community? And I know there's not one right answer for this, but in your experience, I don't want to ask what is the best model to follow, because I think we can also miss it there. But what do you think, what do we need to look for when we speak about the mission of God, and how do we recognize God at work in our communities?
Yeah, that's another great question. Let me throw you some research.
Please.
So there's a whole movement of theology that I think your listeners will be familiar with, called the Missional Church. It comes actually out of a conference that Karl Barth and a few of his friends attended, where they said we must really rediscover or re-acknowledge the fact that it's not that the church has a mission; it is that the missional God has a church.
Sure.
And that shift is massive. So just in terms of naming and labeling, I grew up in a church community where if you said to someone, "We have a missionary here," we would all be in a place where we think of brave souls that went cross-culturally, usually to a different country, and who are ministering the gospel.
Yeah.
And the category we would probably use is to say that they are doing evangelism.
Yes.
Now that is a definite mission and a legitimate mission, but if your imagination becomes colonized that is the only mission, then what people do is they don't see themselves as being part of God's mission. So I do a very simple liturgical thing in our community 3 or 4 times a year. I'll just say, I'm very interested today. Do we have any missionaries here? If there are any missionaries here today, just put up your hand.
Yeah.
And, the community now knows my trick. Some of them still fall for it and don't put up their hands. And
they're gluttons for punishment. Yeah.
Exactly, they're gluttons for punishment. And then I'll say, listen, if we read the Gospels, then we have to say that each one of us is included into this mission.
Sure.
And there's a theologian that did great work on this, who sadly passed away in 1991. His name was David Bosch. He wrote a book that became internationally groundbreaking called Transforming Mission, where he wanted to redefine that the mission of God is multifaceted. It includes evangelism, but it also includes community care. It includes social justice. Sometimes it leads to church planting.
Yes.
So as you said, like it has, he used to say that the mission of God is like a refraction of light.
Yes.
So it's colorful, and part of I think part of the danger is that we put so much emphasis on only one.
Yeah.
So if we think of the Reformation with the priesthood of all believers, you can also think that each person has a mission.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a mission as a doctor or a teacher, a house mom, or, even pastors, have a mission. Even missionaries that go overseas and cross boundaries. So I think part of the work of communities is definitely to figure out, what does that mean for us? This morning I woke early and our gate was locked, so I was trapped in one side of our house because I couldn't get the key. And there was an old book of Andrew Murray that he spoke at the Ketchwich Convention. And I'm reading like a sermon he did in the early 1900s. And he makes the comment, he says, "We are sending missionaries out into the world, but what about the people in our own neighborhood?"
Sure.
And I was like, just like this guy.
It's writing to us.
He's writing to us, our South
Absolutely.
African brother. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that is exactly how we do it. And what I find is a lot of people always think they're only relevant once they have the title of evangelist, pastor, bishop. Well, I don't want to say prophet, priest, but you know what I'm getting at. And a lot of times people look at their secular vocation and they say, can this really contribute to the mission of God? And something I find quite often in this question of what is the mission of God is people saying, what I have is not spiritual enough, or how can it help a community? What would you say to people that find themselves in a place where it's not as spiritual? They don't pray for people. They don't, and then obviously we've got people on the other side. They go to the doctor and the doctor does not give medication, but he rather prays for them. So he makes it again too spiritual when it should be actually very practical. What would you say to people that find themselves in a context where what they have, they don't feel it is spiritual or good enough to feed into this mission of God?
Yeah, I think it's a very deep challenge for the church. Let me tell you a story to illustrate this. A few months ago, someone phones me out of Kleinmond, Afrikaans gentleman, and he asks me some questions. He read another book my wife and I wrote together, and he had some questions about it. And I asked him, say his name is Peter. It wasn't Peter. I say, "So Peter, tell me about yourself." And he answers, "Oh, I'm here in Kleinmond, but I'm just a church member here." And I say to him, "Yes, but you cuss, eh?" And it gets silent on the other end. He's like, "What did I say?" I said, "No, you just used one of the worst words a Christian can use. It's like probably it's worse than the F-bomb." So now it's like silent on the other. He's like, "I think there's something wrong with our line." He's like, "What did I say?" I said, "No, you used the word just." I am just.
Yeah.
And so we are so deeply colonized. You're right. I think it happens in our worship spaces a lot of times. Who gets the microphone? Who's on stage? We have such deep toxic habits in our language.
How do we choose leadership within the church?
Exactly. So I think I'm guessing your audience listening to this, all of them will be some kind of theological geeks or training to be involved in churches. I think our role as followers of Christ that have the opportunity of leadership is to equip people for their ministry.
Yeah, very good.
And
Very good.
Therefore, I think our worship spaces really can become places where we lift out the ordinary ministries of people. The nurses, the teachers. And to frame that, I have a friend, Trevor Hudson, who's a Methodist minister. And you can't do this in all church traditions, but he, when he was still pastoring in Benoni, would have ordination services for the different vocations in his church. So one Sunday he would call all the teachers and he would ordain them for the year. or all the nurses, or all the lawyers, and I think just opening up that imagination could become very, very helpful.
I agree.
There's beautiful international work being done on this. I'm thinking of Redeemer in New York City have these beautiful ways of putting people in different professions together. It's interesting that word. The word profession comes from people who were following Christ in their profession and made a specific profession. So I think rediscovering that our jobs are part of, our discipleship is a massive, massive challenge for church leaders.
For sure.
Because if we don't start to live into that, we cut out probably 8 to 10 hours of people's apprenticing of Jesus out of their lives. So then the dualism starts, as you said. Oh, pastor, I can follow Jesus here at church, but in my real life. So when I hear that kind of language, I always know, here's an adventure to follow. How can I follow that up so that I can maybe help that person understand that their ministry is actually in their real life?
Yeah, for sure.
One of my mentors, Eugene Peterson, wrote a beautiful little book called The Wisdom of Each Other, which I think is
a classic.
It's a classic and a book every pastor should read. And in it he writes letters to a young convert, Gunnar. And then at one stage he writes a letter and he says, Gunnar, you are now at the stage in your life in the church where your minister will tell you that you are really leadership material and that you should join one of the commissions of the church. And then Eugene says something to the effect of, in the Lord's name, please say no. Tell your minister that you already have a ministry as an engineer and that you would really appreciate it if he could equip you how to be an engineer in the name of Christ.
Sure.
And I think there's beautiful stories in our church treasure. Martin Luther, who drove the priesthood of all believers, said, you're not a good shoemaker by making little crosses and putting it on the shoes. He said, make good shoes.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's in our mandate a cultural mandate as well. We are to be fruitful and multiply, and I think do our jobs to the best of our ability.
Absolutely.
And by doing that, avenues open up for the triune God to create and to influence. And so I think there's a massive, massive dualism a lot of times. And the funny thing, Rudolph, is that I find a lot of people in the so-called secular world yearn to be in the church world, and then the people who've been in the church world sort of yearns to be, so it's like we have professional envy on both sides.
Absolutely, yeah. That is interesting. You also wrote about the diversity, and on page 137, you say, as we study the incarnational rhythms of Jesus, we discover that he loves bringing opposites together, reconciling differences. The interesting thing is, for me personally, my perception of some of the churches in South Africa, I used to be a pastor of a multicultural church in the west of Johannesburg. And I can remember I used to reflect and look at the other churches around me. And it was almost as if some of those churches, not all of it, it was the last place where some people could be white, Afrikaans, and they can still do their religion in their language. Where it was quite funny because our church started off white and Afrikaans, and we ended up with a very multicultural, very mixed English church in the community. What do we look at when we speak about God bringing diversity together? Because we've got a lot of people today, they are rather motivated by, you look the same as I do, and we've got this underlying fear of the other. How do we cross that as apprentices of Jesus?
Yeah, let me first of all say that it's really hard.
Yeah.
I think if we think of the disciples themselves, it's not a task that you can go into without the empowerment of the Spirit.
Amen.
So being empowered to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the world is a massive task of crossing differences. I think those first followers were like the Samaritans. I mean,
Yeah, who are they?
we used to call them dogs, you know. Now you want us to be with them, you know. Our country, with its huge divisions, I think has a massive still battle with integration. So I think the diversity is socioeconomic, it's race. You know, I think in this last week, in the South African narrative, where it has become so apparent again how threatened women are, you know, it's reconciling men and women.
Yeah, for sure.
The elder and children, you know, so I think the dream of God is massive. Dallas Willard has this beautiful phrase where he says the aim of God in history is to create an all-inclusive community of love with God in its center as its most glorious inhabitant and sustainer.
Sure.
And I think the challenge is that to live into that is not a strategy that you can blueprint. It's following relationships.
Absolutely.
And it's slow work. I tell the story in Raw Spirituality. We, you know, had to grapple with how to become inclusive with language. You mentioned it. And the moment you talk about language, you're in identity issues. And, you know, people sometimes use the church actually as a cave for ethnicity.
Yeah, for sure.
Instead of discipleship. And it shouldn't surprise us if you read the text. I see there's a whole commentary on Acts. You know, the Acts 6 fight is about the Hebrew-speaking Jews and the Greek-speaking Jews. You know,
yeah,
so there's very early in the narrative all these tensions. And I think, you know, for communities to learn how to be hospitable is probably one of the major things. I'm following my mission at this moment, going back into the Dutch Reformed Church, the NG Kerk, which is an Afrikaans church. And this Sunday, I was so thankful. We hosted the University of Johannesburg's choir. And our whole service was in English. And I said to my colleagues yesterday, the fact that we didn't get one phone call saying, hey, I couldn't worship my God in my language today is
it's the best news ever.
It is so helpful. And I think, you know, obviously with our identities, you know, Christ loves the Afrikaner and the Sotho and the Xhosa and the Zulu and the English. But I think the church is being challenged how to partner, how to, you know, follow God's mission together. And for us as South Africans, it's a tough nut to crack still.
Yeah, for sure.
Martin Luther King Jr. used to say that, you know, 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning in America used to be the most segregated hour. I think in South Africa, unfortunately, a lot of times that is still the case. I think if you widen the lens a little bit and think of God's church not just as a community that meets on a Sunday for an hour, there's a lot of integration that is starting to happen.
Absolutely.
But I think our generation, and I mean, we're talking to each other as two white males, you know, I think if we shrink South Africa to a town of 100 people, we are 7 out of that 100. So I always say in Afrikaans to people, ons gaan moet leer hoe om saam met die ander maatjies te speel.
Yeah, for sure.
God has many playmates, you know, and so difference becomes part of this. I think learning the habits of listening, you know, not being arrogant.
Yeah.
You know, we live unfortunately in the shadow of centuries of colonialism.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think it invites us into different reflexes and postures. So, yeah.
On page 163, you said something that is really incredible, and I think it just adds on to what you've just spoken of. You say that we are all part of God's mission. All Christians are in full-time ministry, and you've just stated that beautifully. But I want to focus on that first part. We are all part of God's mission. In a way, I think in the past sense, missionaries came to Africa and in a way thought that teaching people to eat with a knife and fork. You are salvaging people and saving them from themselves. Where the church now, in Africa, the challenge is to enter those wild spaces that you mentioned in the book. And I think there's a lot of pastors that are sitting in their churches and they don't know how to take the first step. Can you maybe give a indication as to what would be a good first step when we reach out to these other greater communities within our context? And this is for both black and white pastors. I know of black pastors that are scared to go to another church or a different setting and to really reach out to those communities. So what would you suggest?
I mean, these are just suggestions, definitely. Let me go back to the research I wanted to mention earlier. In research in the Missional Church in the last decade, they have found that when communities talk about the activity of God, God is only mentioned 5% of the times as the active operative of verbs in their community.
That's incredible.
So one of the things that is helpful in the Missional Church is something I already mentioned, is to move conversations away from church questions primarily to God questions.
Yeah, very good.
What is God up to? How can we join God's promised and preferred future in this community? I think that becomes a process that opens up journeys of discernment. So instead of blueprinting what we are bringing into this community, is to follow the clues of what God is doing. I think Luke 10 is a beautiful example of this, how Jesus sends his disciples into the community. He tells them to allow the community to be hospitable towards them, to find the people of peace. So I think, for churches, I would say slowly, shift the questions and then start these discernment journeys where we learn how to be in other people's shoes, to meet God in the other. I think go and learn what is happening in your community.
Yeah, for sure.
Some churches operate as if the community equals their church building.
Yeah, very good.
And that's the idea of the parish. But, start to see where join in partnership with God in the neighborhood. And then we discover that we're not alone.
Exactly.
Sometimes we think we're like Elijah. We're running away like, God, there's no one.
Absolutely.
And then the Lord's like, listen, I have a gang of 7,000 that's working on this. So partnerships, I think, becomes really, really important. That you mentioned this earlier, that the mission is not to trademark people to our denomination or to our local church, but to allow people to join in God's kingdom.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of people insecure.
Exactly, because you are expending energy that might not reflect back onto people tithing in your church or bums on seats.
Yeah.
So there's a dying that needs to take place.
Sure.
But I think those two things are massive. Maybe just a third thing, I think there's a huge challenge in terms of our core message. What is our core message?
Very good.
I think a lot of pastors can't really reflect holistically on the question, what is the gospel?
Amen.
And I see this. I have the opportunity to work with quite a few denominations. And I'll just tell one story. The other day I asked a group of almost 200 ministers, if a congregant should ask you what is the gospel, what would your answer be? And they round-tabled it and had a 20-minute conversation, and we did feedback. Beautiful answers, ranging from love to the cross to the resurrection but the word kingdom was never there. So I said, well, if we think through how Jesus summarized, it was the good news of the availability of the kingdom. So I said, I'm just struck by the omission. And then one pastor put up his hand and he said, yeah, but it's implied. The kingdom is implied. So I asked him, so how do your congregants know this? And he said, well, in 1996, I did a 3-week sermon series on the kingdom. So everybody started laughing, just like you. So I think, those discovering God as the active partner, our community, and then really reflecting on, so what is the gospel? So,
Yeah, that is key. Tom, thank you so much for being with us today. I would love to go on and on and on, and maybe in the future we can do another conversation on a lot of these issues and really pull it apart. But thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for having this conversation with us. And I hope you come back soon, because you are close, so we'll definitely do this again.
Yeah, it's a great privilege. We've got a website, my colleague and I, called rhythmoflife.co.za. If the book is too far on Amazon, they're welcome to email us through that. We love to have conversation with people when they buy the book. It'll be cheaper than Amazon as well. So
that's good to
they're
hear.
welcome to contact me in that way.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Tom. Thank you.